Okay. Hello, Roger.
Hey,
Thank
Jim.
you for being willing to do this with me.
Sure.
My name is Dr. Jim Porter. I've got a PhD in mental health counseling, and I do counseling in the Gainesville area, and that's about it for me. And this is my friend, and you are.
I'm Roger Reep, and I am a retired professor at the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Florida. My area of expertise was neuroscience.
And are you still popping in there every once in a while nowadays?
I'm still writing book chapters and writing papers with colleagues. Yeah.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
okay. So you don't
research
have to
papers.
be messing with the brains.
No, I'm not. I'm not doing any active laboratory work.
Oh, okay, okay. Thank you. So the reason I wanted to talk to Roger is for one reason, he has a lot more experience actually conducting research studies and I guess getting them through in IRB boards and all that kind of stuff, from pre to post, getting published and all that kind of stuff. And as a mental health counselor, I have some access to the scientific literature, and I have a lot of access to ongoing training, and I've had a lot of good training, and I think I'm a very good mental health counselor. But I realize in various arenas, in my opinion, that science is one of our most brilliant informants nowadays in our society, and the discipline of science is important. And right now, there's even controversy in the world about the coronavirus, and there was something else that was, well, actually, everyone seems to know about mental health when they come into my office because I'm Jim Porter and it says licensed mental health counselor. They just seem to trust that I might know what I'm talking about. And I'm fine with that, but I also like the idea of them having a good reason to do that.
Right.
So I do think I have a lot of knowledge and a lot of expertise and a lot of experience and a lot of training. But how do you know when you're talking to anyone about anything, if it's a very important topic, to that there's some validity, that there's a way of, and actually, why don't I start with that concept right there?
Sure.
Because it could be, a trusted loved one. Maybe I'll start at the top. Why is science so different than maybe every other way of knowing or learning?
Well, the first thing I would say is that when we say science, I'm going to assume we mean as properly carried out, because like in any other field, there are people that take shortcuts and use deceit and make up things. In my experience and the experience of my colleagues, it's a very rare thing, but it does happen. And you see papers retracted in the literature from time to time. So there are a lot of pressures that drive that. And one is, if you're in an academic setting, there's pressure to publish. Your advancement in your career and your rewards are based on productivity. And that's one of the primary areas of productivity is how many papers you put out. And of course, how many grant dollars you bring in. So it's all, there's a machinery there behind the scenes that drives the motivational aspects of it. But in terms of science and why it's different, if you and I were walking down the street looking at the trees, the leaves in the trees, and we each were asked to describe what we see, we would have similar descriptions, but there would also be some probable differences of what we would notice. And so the idea of science is, what is it we can agree on in what we observe, and how do we get to that point of agreement? So what we do is we say, well, we have to safeguard against our subjectivity when we do science. We have to safeguard against our biases, which as a psychology-oriented person, you know what that is. We have these intrinsic biases to want things to be a certain way or to feel a certain way or to look a certain way or results to come out a certain way. So that can really mess things up if you're doing experiments in nature. So when we do experiments, we have to have protocols. And ideally, you have more than one person doing the experiment so that you get replicability, okay? So that the findings that I get, either you verify by doing the same experiment and getting the same findings, that's ideal, or at least there's some process that my work gets checked on. And the way we do that commonly in science is that we submit our findings for peer review. And that means I've collected data, I've put it in the form of a paper, I've justified my methods that I used in very great detail. I present the results and I quantify things in some form or another, whether it's with statistical analysis or some other sort of analysis. So there are objective, factual aspects to what we're doing, but there's a lot of, for instance, two different investigators can disagree on what the proper statistical test is to use in a certain setting. Or when you do experiments, you have to do not only the experiment you're interested in, but you have to do a bunch of control experiments to rule out other factors that might have been involved. So, for instance, if you're doing a clinical study and you find a correlation between eating a certain food and gaining weight, you find that the more people that eat that food, the people that eat more of that food tend to be heavier. That's a correlational study. But it might be that the people that are attracted to that food are driven by some other factor, like, that they grew up in the South, let's say. There might be some other factor that's completely something we're not looking at that's driving the results. So the problem in science is that you never know that you have your hands on all the important variables. Okay?
Yeah.
So this is what creates the thing you learn to live with if you're doing science right, is that there's an incompleteness. You never prove a hypothesis, you only test a hypothesis. And so that means that you never know you've got the final answer, and we see that with modern technology developing in the last, say, 30 years. I'm thinking of microchips and so forth, all the fantastic devices like our iPhones that we've seen develop. The idea that things progress rapidly should be commonplace to most people by now. And that means that there's always something new coming down the road. And the same is true in science. Aside from the technological innovations that are happening, new ideas are coming. Oh, maybe if we look at it this way, or maybe if we look at it that way, we could factor in this thing over here. Yeah. So that incompleteness means that if you're really a good scientist, you're aware that every time you make a finding of something, every time you discover something, it raises about 10 questions for every answer that you get. And so that means to me that our ignorance grows faster than our knowledge. And I find that the proper response to that is to be humble, because that means I know a lot. I'm a lot more aware of my ignorance now than I was before. So the idea that we have certainty in science is very erroneous to me. We have certainty in the method because the method is airtight when it's done properly. It's logical, it's peer-reviewed. When I submit a paper, it is sent out typically to 2 reviewers that know the field and are not my buddies or anything like that. And the editor at the journal that I would submit this to is the one that decides who they're going to use to review it. I review papers from other people. And so when I was coming up in grad school, one of my mentors told me, he said, if you want to have a good life in science, you got to learn to be your own harshest critic, so that by the time you send that paper out, you've tried to wrestle with yourself and decide, where are the weak points in my argument? What do I need more data on this point or that point? Because by the time it gets to peer review, these are people, our job as a reviewer is to be as picky as possible, to find everything we can. We're attacking it because if I get a paper to review, the person's trying to make a case. Think of it as a legal brief, if you will. They're making a case, they're presenting evidence, and they're interpreting the evidence, usually in the discussion section of the paper, the final discussion section. They're interpreting the evidence in a certain conceptual framework. So I might say, you know what, I think you did a great job collecting the data and analyzing it, but I disagree with your interpretation. That's totally valid. They don't have to agree with me. The editor may say, well, Reep, you're out to lunch and these other people have a good idea, we're going to go with it. So as a reviewer, I'm not guaranteed my ideas are going to get listened to, but that's the way the process works. And so it's imperfect because people are imperfect. So it depends on the 2 reviewers that you get. I got a paper reviewed once, and one of the reviews was, I felt, very bad because it seemed like the person hadn't read the paper very well and their conclusions weren't warranted. So I contacted the editor and said that. And so they sent it to another reviewer and the paper finally got accepted. So there are human glitches all along the way. I don't think any scientist would claim otherwise, that's being honest. But we're working with a method that allows multiple observers to see the same thing. So when we're walking down the street and we're doing science, I'm going to point to a tree and say, Jim, let's focus on that tree and count all the leaves on that tree. And we should be getting the same answer because we've agreed on a goal.
Yeah, that with two sets of eyes, if you get the same count and I get the same count, we feel pretty solid. If mine's wildly different, we don't feel very solid at all.
That's right.
If there's a slight difference, maybe a few fell off or something like that.
So I think the idea of science to me is we're born in ignorance. We start from darkness. We don't know anything. Let's just say that's your starting point. How are we going to, it's the old thing about the blind men with the elephant, how are we going to proceed under those circumstances? We have to agree upon some criteria. And that's what science is a set of criteria by which to explore the natural world. That's really all that it is.
So that kind of reminds me of a question that I didn't write down, but
okay.
What it feels like. And what I mean is I guess there are several scenarios or settings that someone who's doing research can be in. One of them is industry, and two broad ones are industry and higher education. So you're a professor at a university, you can be working, or someone can be working in a lab in industry. And we're talking also about the checks and the human motivations behind the check. The fact that we know someone's going to review our write-up, our report, right? And so just how do you think a lot of people conducting research feel when their hypothesis is nullified, when it's found that their expectation before the exercise turns out to be wrong?
Well, there's lots of times in science that things don't work out. And of course, that never gets reported in the literature because it's not very interesting. It's important though. And in fact, it's so important that years ago, there was as a spoof, there was a journal started called the Journal of Irreproducible Results. And it was meant to be humorous, but it was also meant to get at that point and remind us in a very lighthearted way that there are a lot of observations that never get reported. Because either they might be rare phenomena that are not repeatable, and those are legitimate phenomena. Science is very well equipped to deal with phenomena that occur either regularly or reliably or repeatably, those kind of phenomena, because in order to verify, you have to keep observing and keep observing. And okay, what if I do this? How does that change the phenomena? You play with it kind of, if you will, in an experimental fashion. And if we have, one event, it might be very meaningful to you as an individual, but it doesn't have anything to do with science because nobody else experienced it, So there's a weak link there in terms of
I see.
repeatability.
It could be seen in two ways. There's a weak link there, but you also can, you're not wanting to register everything that might have been a random fluke.
That's right. So when you do experiments and you get confusing results, let's say, or as you mentioned, these days when, at least in the environment that I was in at the University of Florida in the neuroscience, the grad students were usually in their first semester, were taking statistics. So they got used to the idea of the mechanics of how you test hypotheses. And you set up a hypothesis and you gather the data, and either the data will support the hypothesis, which means, like I did a treatment on these cells and I got this response. This molecule went up. Okay, so that supported my hypothesis that this was going to happen. Okay.
Okay.
But if it didn't go up very much, or if it didn't go up at all, then that nullifies my hypothesis. That contradicts my hypothesis. So you can only disprove a hypothesis or contradict a hypothesis. That's one alternative outcome if it didn't work the way you thought it did, or you support the hypothesis. You don't ever disprove a hypothesis for the reason I mentioned before, because we're only looking at part of the manipulations that can be done with the system. There might be a zillion other things going on we're not even assessing,
Yeah.
and usually there are
Yeah.
in a system as complex as a biological entity.
And we're always working with nature, no matter if it's technology or whether it's
or moon rocks.
Or moon rocks,
it's still the natural world. So, but in a human sense, it's very common and it's very frustrating when you invest a lot of time and energy and money, which usually scientists don't have a lot of money to invest. So it's a precious resource, but and things don't work out. You don't. So when your hypothesis is shot down, then obviously it means you need to consider another perspective. And sometimes you have the luxury of doing that and say, okay, it wasn't that hypothesis wasn't true, or wasn't supported by the data. What other hypothesis can we come up with that makes any sense in this context? And then you try some other variables, some other factors to make your cell do something. And oh, well, we missed the fact that, before this molecule A could have an effect, we had to introduce molecule B to facilitate things, something like that. And you didn't know that at first.
That reminds me a bit about something I think you kind of hinted at earlier, is that there's funding involved, there are institutions involved, there are resources involved. And so when it's hard to make a plausible case for like getting the permission from the institutional review board, I guess maybe we'll talk about that. But anyway, getting permission, getting funding, getting resources to conduct a study, you do, I think part of the pressure of peer review and the institutional and social aspects of scientific research is that you're wanting to work towards something that may seem to have a little bit of support, something that's arguable. So you won't be just going over here and say, I think that I can lift a rock by blowing very hard. I don't know if that's out there enough. That actually doesn't sound so bad. But anyway, but what I'm saying is that you're not going to be just popping around. You might be, for example, you have to write, what do you call it when you're requesting the permission to do a certain research? A proposal?
So it depends on the context, but if I'm writing to get monetary support, that's called a grant proposal. And I would send it to a place like the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health. If I'm requesting institutional permission to use animals for animal research, then I go through what's called an institutional animal use board, IACUC. And let's see, Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. That's what IACUC stands for. If I'm doing human research, I go through an IRB, an Institutional Review Board. So there's separate entities that review those. And their job is not to review the grant per se and judge the scientific merits of it. Their job is to make sure that you're not using excessive numbers of subjects, for example, and that you're not doing things that are unethical, and that you're anesthetizing using proper anesthesia drugs and those kind of things. Animal care and use, is the focus with the IACUC. And with the IRB, it's similar because you're using human subjects, and so there are strict rules and regulations about how to do that. And it's all this has all come about since the early 90s, that these boards play a major role in how things are done and keeping an eye on how things are done. And when you get approval, you have to submit updates every year or at other intervals. So it's a regular oversight that's done, and that nobody's interested in harming animals. And when we do animal research, we're very conscious of the fact that this is another life form we're manipulating, and some of the experiments are terminal experiments where we kill the animal and take the brain out and section it and look for where things went. So you are engaging in taking a life in order to find out
Mm.
hopefully significant information. Now, if it's a rat, there's plenty of rats around, and not many people, cry too much over using rats for research. But then you start talking about cats and dogs and sheeps and monkeys, and it gets a little different.
Okay.
So there's a very good rationale for
Right.
having these review boards. Yeah.
And so, in a roundabout way, that brings me to sort of there's a couple of things. I was thinking about peer review, and I was thinking about different kinds of research design, and therefore different kinds of research reports. So one of them is peer review. I guess I can assume that you feel that that's a good process because I will ask this: do you believe peer review is one of the things that keeps researchers trying to make the best, most valid research designs, choosing the best, most valid research lines, lines of inquiry, meaning does the peer review help the science be more reliable?
Well, without question,
Okay.
in my mind, you mentioned before, and it is true that science is a sociological enterprise because it involves people. And so the motivation to do a certain type of experiment can be driven by the fact that, hey, NIH has a lot of money for, COVID research. Let's do COVID research, or similar hot things that get hot topics, because we all have to survive. And if you can't get grant money to do experiment X, then you get the money that's available to do experiment Y. Now, I was the type of person that would rather starve and do what the hell I wanted than to go down the on the bandwagon effect. Because the reason I got into science is because I wanted to explore my own ideas. But you pay the price when you do that. But it's still a sociological phenomenon, and peer review it comes into play when you're writing a grant. If I send a grant to NSF or NIH, it gets reviewed by a whole panel of people.
Yes.
They're what are called primary reviewers and secondary reviewers. So you might have 12 people on a panel, and they're reviewing maybe 100 grants or something like that. And each person has a certain, 3 or 4 that they're primary reviewer on, and then 3 or 4 that they're the secondary reviewer on.
Okay.
So you still have 2 sets of eyes. They present their reviews to the rest of the panel, and the rest of the panel is empowered to ask questions and, well, what about this? What about that? So it's a very serious process of peer review just to get a grant funded. Now, so the peer review in the larger sense applies not just to publications, but to grant review too. And then, of course, when you're doing publications, as I mentioned before, all your methods are scrutinized, whether you used the right experimental design, did you have the proper control studies, and did you analyze the data appropriately? Did you interpret things? Did you miss the fact that, Professor X over here 2 years ago found something contrary to what you said, and you didn't even mention it? That kind of thing. So I think peer review is built into the way modern science is done at the funding level and at the publishing level.
Okay. To me, that sounds pretty powerful. There was a long time when I was in college and after I got out of college that I thought, but I could just totally fake data. How do I know that this doesn't happen? I could totally say I'm carrying out these experiments, but how is the board going to know, the review panel? And but I think there is an answer to that in my head now. So yeah, go ahead.
People can still fabricate data. I know personally of some situations where that's occurred, and it's devastating because the students associated with that laboratory can suffer. If it was a student that fabricated data, the professor can suffer. So you can make up data and you can have it written down in a notebook or whatever. When we did experiments, we worked on rat brains, as most of our work was done on rat brains, and we would keep them so that anybody that wanted to could come look at the data that we had. And in my area, we were reporting largely anatomical results, and so you could see the data in the paper. We had images that showed the patterns of brain connections in that case that we were talking about. But it is a problem. And as I mentioned, science is a sociological process. People are not perfect, and so peer review is not perfect. But it's sort of like democracy. It's a terrible system, but it's better than all the other ones.
Yeah. Right.
So right now that's what we have. And you might say to yourself, well, couldn't you have four people review a paper every time? And yes, you could in theory, but in practice, what happens is if I'm a busy professor and I'm asked to review a paper, I do it because it's part of my responsibilities as a professional. And I want somebody to do it for me when I submit a paper. I want to have a good, solid review. But editors commonly at lots of journals have trouble finding enough reviewers. So to find two is plenty of work. Believe me, to find two qualified reviewers is plenty of work. So we can always imagine things being better, but the resources to do it time-wise and money-wise are pretty daunting.
Mm-hmm. I remember receiving the article back with comments, and as a doc student, I felt a little bit intimidated because I wanted to make sure that I represented myself correctly and that I didn't sound stupid.
Right.
And so yeah, I think, again, us being humans, I can see how the pressures are to, I think most people want to be honest, but I think the pressure is there to be more honest, more clear. And I think most people are interested in doing good research that get into research.
Well, yeah, because I mean, science, you're not going to get rich being a scientist most of the time. It's a lot of hard work. A lot of it's done in isolation. You have to write things. You do a lot of writing, a lot of reading. It's tedious work. And so, yeah, there's not that many people that get into it to take advantage of it because there's a lot of other fields where you could get more bang for your buck if you want to be a cheater.
I keep wondering why I didn't major in cheating. I only minored. No, but okay. So there's another check that occurs to me as you talk, and that is there are folks all around who do research that will be reading your article eventually, hopefully, right? If it's you know, and they'll have questions or they'll feel like they concur with what not only your well, I guess the results are when you verify or don't verify the hypothesis, right?
Yeah, but to extend the sociological context,
Yeah.
What you're getting at is why scientific meetings are really important, because that's where you physically come together with your colleagues, meaning the people that are interested in the same things you are, and you discuss each other's findings. And someone will come up to you and say, "Hey, I read in your paper this and that, and I found this thing, and they seem to fit together." Or you'll get a phone call or an email. That's a very common thing too. I read your paper and I'm wondering about this technique, and we want to try that technique. These are common interchanges of communication. So if you're doing science in what I would consider a inviting way, then you will have discourse with your other people in the field. Now, there are scientists that are very protective and suspicious and don't want to talk about anything more than they have to. But I would say my experience has been anyway that the vast majority are, we want to tell you what we know. If you're a scientist, you want to be able to spout off and say the things you know and show your stuff. So at a meeting, a lot of really great interactions take place. It's not just going to hear a talk, it's having a conversation in the middle of the aisle with somebody. Like we do a lot of poster sessions in recent years. That's a common way to present your findings. So imagine, the San Diego Convention Center filled with, hundreds of posters every day on neuroscience topics. And thousands of people, 30,000 people are roaming around at these meetings. And so you're standing at your poster for your designated 2-hour period, and people are coming up and you're telling them what the flow of the study was, and they're asking questions because they're doing something similar and they're interested in it for this reason or that reason. And that's where the real social sort of intercourse takes place that tends to introduce you to new ideas and new perspectives.
Does it seem to bring some sort of social intellectual testing where you're like, oh my gosh, that's something I didn't think
Oh,
of?
all the time,
Okay.
all the time. Yeah, and I love that part of it because I was always aware that okay, so I can feel like if I know that part of science is this incompleteness that I mentioned, where it's like what Alan Watts used to call the wisdom of insecurity, like knowing you don't know everything,
Yeah.
and you can either feel really bad about that and go around moping all the time, or you can be open to the fact that, well, there's all these other people at this meeting. I might learn something from them that helps me, and that used to happen regularly. But you have to engage.
Yeah.
You have to engage with your colleagues for that to happen. And I found that to be a very, in fact, overstimulating.
Oh yeah.
Very
After
stimulating.
3 or 4 days.
After 3 or 4 days, I was wasted.
Yeah.
There's no more energy left.
Convention hangover.
A lot of input. Yeah. A lot of great ideas.
Oh, that reminded me of 3 things, but I'll pick one. One of them is, okay, so I'll go back to something that was on my mind a few seconds ago, and that is also, I think maybe responding to research findings with new research projects, right? Meaning somebody sees your stuff, they're not sure, and one way to find out if you're missing something, like for example, that third variable that no one else thought of, a person might I think there's a critical eye most of the time, and then they apply that critical eye to teasing out their past research findings or yours, right? And then also the conclusions that come from the findings.
Yeah, and the thing is, when you, even within one lab, when we are doing a study, there's a natural tendency, you're very aware, like, oh, we should be doing this thing too, and this other thing, and we could add more information about this, but you have to break it off at some point and send that publication in. You can't just have one giant publication at the end of your career that sums everything up. It doesn't work that way. It's not manageable. But you're right. There's always an awareness. If you're a creative science, if you're in a creative science area, there's always an awareness of 3 or 4 next studies to do. And as you're suggesting, sometimes that awareness comes through other people because I don't have time to do them all. So my friend in Nashville may do a follow-up experiment because they're interested in the same thing, but we both learned from it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that can take the form of cooperative, collegial collaboration, or it can take the form of a competitive environment. So if you have a crowded area of science, there tends to be more competition for obvious reasons because the productivity is going to bear on who gets the next grant and all that kind of stuff. So there is competition under certain circumstances, and hopefully we're always competing with ourselves to up our game too.
It makes sense to me. This is kind of switching in a way.
Okay.
I would say, I don't know, levels, broadness, depth versus breadth of different kinds of research. So what I'm thinking of is stuff like all the way from a very precise question done by one person where they've done enough laboratory testing on, I don't know, just one hypothesis, and they're going to write conclusions from it. But I'm thinking about the different levels, like from just I don't know if I want to call it a simple study, you might know a better name for it, to things like research reviews and then meta-analyses.
Oh, okay.
And because we hear people say, well, my brother drove without a seatbelt his entire life and he lived to age 90. And you could do a research that is too small to find anything, is big enough to find something. But like you said, that exact research report that was done very well may not be duplicable. Somebody else might do it and might not find the same thing about seatbelts, for example. So over time, there are reports that summarize a broader base of reports. So does that make sense, what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah. So let me pick an example. Let's say there's a particular protein in the cells of the nervous system that regulates glucose metabolism, or helps to regulate glucose metabolism. And that's important because glucose is the fuel that your central nervous system runs on. So maybe my friend in the lab over next door has spent their whole career characterizing the structure of this protein. They know the DNA sequence, they know the RNA, they know the what are called the subunits of the protein. They know how it works to open up and let the glucose in, or close and not let the glucose in. They know what cofactors are going to facilitate that process and what other molecules might inhibit that process. So, and they've done all their studies in a mouse model, okay?
Oh.
Now, my other friend down the hall comes along and says, I wonder if other animals have this same protein. So they start looking at other mammals and they say, oh yeah, well, you know, almost all the other mammals have either that protein or one that's very, very similar to it. And then my other friend way down the hall, who's an evolutionary biologist, says, well, why limit it to mammals? Let's look at vertebrates and invertebrates and you know, sponges and things like that. And so, and these are real things that are done. So neurotransmitters would be an example where people have done phylogenetic studies. That's, you know, what you would call
like kingdom, phylum.
Well, if you looked at a whole slew of different kinds of animals,
okay,
and your focus was on, say, this particular protein or set of molecules, and that research may have gone on over a very extensive amount of time, you know. So what you're talking about when a meta-analysis is, well, when a review article is done, a review article basically is kind of a qualitative meta-analysis. In other words, the review article, the author of the review article is looking broadly at a certain body of literature, but they're applying their own perspective, and they're free to do that. They're choosing what to focus on, what's important, and they're the reason you do a review article is A, to get a handle on the literature, but B, to see how it fits in with your conceptual framework and to put that forward.
And I imagine you could do an exhaustive one where you think you can get all the literature. You can do, you pick some using some logic, or you could pick the research from the research in some more random way or something like that, randomly sample the articles out there? Or?
Yeah, usually, yes, because it's hard to be totally complete in a complex field.
Yeah.
So usually the way that you narrow it down is not by excluding some articles and accepting others, because that's a little too subjective. What you would do is you would narrow your aims, your goals of the review to a certain sphere. And then within that sphere, you would try, if you're doing a good review, to hit all the literature. Now, the meta-analysis has taken on a much more prominent role, you know, since the advent of big data analysis type of approaches, because now you're doing a review, but you're doing it in a quantitative way. So let's say there's a drug on the market that's supposed to have a certain effect. Well, there might have been, you know, clinical trials done, several clinical trials done over the years.
Which means you've got the patients and you keep data on regular patients?
Yeah, it means that you've got human individuals, and a randomized double-blind clinical trial means there's this new drug. We're thinking that it might be effective for depression, let's say. And we recruit subjects and we tell them, you may get the actual drug or you may get a neutral substance that's a control substance. We won't let you know until the end. And so that's your control experiment. Some people got the drug. Some people thought they got a similar looking pill, but it didn't have anything in it except saline.
And they use random to pick them.
In the best clinical trials, you're randomly assigning who gets what. Okay. You've got a lot of controls, like, is the age homogeneous? What about the genders? What about pre-existing conditions? What about socioeconomic? You know, there's a whole lot of variables that you try your best to equalize between the groups. But the reality is that in many clinical trials, you just don't have enough numbers to normalize all the variables. But
Oh, right.
so a clinical trial is, they're difficult to do. They take a long time, and sometimes the results are clear cut, and sometimes they're not. So after maybe this drug has been around now for 40 years, let's say, and there have been a number of clinical trials. So you decide, I want to put these all together and see what the total picture is. So that's a meta-analysis. Now, the reason it's called a meta-analysis is because you're not doing a new study, you're analyzing collectively the studies that have been done, but your analysis means these days you're doing it in a very clear and quantified way. So you have to go in and figure out, how am I going to compare the results from this clinical trial to this one when there were some differences, maybe in the patient groups, right, maybe in the dosage of the drug. There's all kinds of things like that. So there are different, I won't go into the details, there's different ways people do what's called normalize the data. But it's that,
like if there are a lot of variables, just visibly, mathematically, you sort of bring them into line. So you,
yeah. Sometimes there's ways statistically to normalize, but often there are assumptions you have to make in order to do that. And in science, there's nothing wrong with making assumptions as long as you make them explicit to the reader and to whoever's reading your results. If you say, we had to set a baseline somewhere, so we arbitrarily chose this point. Well, people may argue with where you picked your baseline point, your reference point, let's say, but they can't argue with the fact that you were clear about it.
Right. Yes.
So you're being honest. You're always trying to tell the whole story if you're doing science correctly. You're not saying I'm right. That's not the point. You're saying, here's how we set things up and here's what we found. Mm-hmm. Of course, you try to set them up so that you'll get quality results that other people will agree with. Mm-hmm. That is the most happy outcome, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be the outcome.
I guess, and you can sometimes find a precedent that there's a procedure that you can borrow from other research.
Oh, all the time. Yeah.
That kind of thing.
We steal liberally.
Yeah. So this is kind of another switch. Gosh, I'd like to do 5 of these videos, but this is another switch. There are ways that people, just the rest of us that are walking around on the pavement, can get in touch with information, and there's various different qualities. And if we really think, the scientific method and research conducted using the scientific method is very high quality, there are places that you can get closer to that and further away. For example, you saw my notes here. There's if you hear a journalistic report about a scientific study, we just hinted at the difference between one really good scientific study and 100 really good scientific studies on the same subject. It could be totally different. So I guess what I'm saying is, let's say you're a walk-a-day person and you want to feel like what you're listening to has some validity to it, that it's not just me on the internet saying something silly. And you may not have the time, energy, money, and permission to get every article that's out there or whatever.
Right.
And you can't necessarily, I don't know.
Well, so what you're talking about is, what sources can we trust?
Yeah.
As a non-practicing scientist.
Yeah.
And it is my contention that either science has done a very mediocre job of communicating its findings to the public, or the public is not very interested in science. And they're probably both true to a certain degree, but I think that these days with the internet, there are a number of really good scientific outlets that are geared toward the interested layperson, let's say. So science advances. Science magazine, everybody knows what Science magazine is, Nature magazine. Certain articles in both those you can access freely online. Some you can't. And I wish that the economics of publishing were such that all the science that's produced would be publicly available. On the flip side of it, as you mentioned, if you're a layperson, you're not going to feel equipped to read through those primary reports. So then you might say, well, let me read the review articles. But I'll tell you, in a specialty area, like let's just say neuroscience, reading Nature Reviews Neuroscience, which is that kind of only review articles, is still a daunting task, even for a practicing neuroscientist, if it's not exactly in the field I'm familiar with. So that's why I think Scientific American is a well-known magazine for years.
That one's pretty good.
And that's very good for what they cover, but they don't cover all subjects equally. Science News is good. There's one called New Scientist that's sometimes better than others. There's Quanta, which is a site that deals mostly with mathematics and physics, but also has articles about biology. It's challenging, but it's written. It doesn't have a lot of math or anything like that. It's written for people that are interested in these things. The other thing is, for instance, the New York Times has a science section, and they have really good science reporters. So it's, you're not going to see it on the front page of the New York Times, but when you go up in the masthead and you look at the different sections, there's always a science section, and they have excellent articles. I agree with you, though. It's very, you have to do some work to get at good articles. There's another good magazine called American Scientist that's sort of like Scientific American. They tend to be more, they tend to emphasize more engineering kinds of science, but they do have articles about biology as well, and occasionally geology. Speaking of geology as a science, there are, there's many websites about geology run by, say, a particular university or a particular professional organization. So I think the thing to do is to try and figure out what sources are conscientiously interested in the subject you're interested in. If you want to get good information, you don't go to just the easiest. You don't do a Google search and take the first thing that comes up necessarily. You, like, for instance, Stanford University has some excellent web resources related to all kinds of subjects, including science and the humanities. And so, I would start with those kinds of sources where you have where they have a long-standing record of quality. I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess, again, now that I say that out loud, I kind of thought you'd have the perfect answer, like, oh, the journal articles are the best. But again, even for you, you can read a lot of journal articles, and some of them are going to be, there's 5 terms that they're using that I don't use in my everyday. So basically, in a sense, we're all in the same boat in a way.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
as a practicing scientist, I sometime after about the year 2000, the publications just started being so frequent, so overwhelming that I couldn't keep up even with the things I was interested in. And so I had to really let a lot of stuff go that I just didn't have time to read. And so, yeah, if you're feeling that way as a non-scientist, totally understandable, and anybody that's honest about it. So the people that do keep up have the most narrow focus, because you can keep up with everything if your focus is really narrow.
Yeah.
But then you're missing a whole range of phenomena, and the average person is not that narrowly focused. They want to know what's happening in biology.
Yeah.
Or what's the latest dinosaur fossils that have been found,
Yeah.
Those kind of things. The other thing I would say about science is that you can go to, like, the Smithsonian has a lot of resources on their website, and other museums that specialize in subjects that are more biological or geological have a lot of information on their websites.
That brings up, because again, I think everybody thinks these are special times, or there's a lot of doubt, and there's a lot of. But I also think that throughout history, there's always been some doubt. Of course, that's like probably a very functional part of being human to
Yeah.
doubt. And so what's coming up for me is that the opposite might be trust. You could say faith, but I'm going to use the word trust.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is, to some degree, unless we could just clear all our brains squeaky clean with no information in them, we're making assumptions
All
of
the
what
time.
we can trust
Oh, all the time.
all day long.
Even in science, even a professional scientist, if I'm reading papers, as I said in the beginning of our discussion, the ideal thing is for me to repeat everybody's experiments to make sure I get the same answer. But we don't
Replication.
we don't do
Yeah,
that.
right.
You know,
Right.
I'm not going to do that. You would never be done. So you're correct. What I'm doing a lot of the times as a practicing scientist and what other professional scientists are doing is I'm putting my faith and my trust in the peer review system.
So kind of like money, we have to decide where we're going to bestow our trust.
Right.
Because
Right. And you know, um, as I mentioned, science is a human endeavor, so it's naturally imperfect and incomplete. Um, and so it's always healthy to acknowledge that, because we acknowledge the fact that even with our best intentions and our best efforts, there's still going to be rough spots and incompleteness spots and lots more questions than answers. Um, but yeah, we make progress.
that reminds me, oh, good. That reminds me of a question I had earlier, and I'm going to ask it in a different way. And that is, in it, on some level, do a lot of people in research like it when they find out they're wrong?
Well, if you're creative enough, then what you do with finding out your hypothesis was not supported, which is basically
Yeah.
what you mean when you say wrong, that the result came out opposite to what you expected. If you're creative enough, you can turn that around and say, okay, what is this telling me? Where should I look next? What's the next hypothesis that I would be clever enough to come up with that takes me from where I'm at to some new place? And you have to be lucky to some extent in guessing the right road to go down, because believe me, for any observation, there's about 10 hypotheses you could generate for the next test of what's going on in that system. And so part of it is having educated guesses. And as you mentioned before, building on the findings of others. So many times, you know, I'm not just relying on my own observations, I'm relying on the context of all the other findings by other people that might pertain to my next move
Okay.
that I'm going to make. So yeah, that's I wouldn't say they're happy, but uh, you are getting an answer. It might not be the one you wanted, but you are getting an answer that has the potential to lead somewhere productive. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can see for me there would be a tension because I want my career to go well if I were
Of course.
working, but I would also
Yeah.
want to know.
You see, that's the thing. Scientists are no different than other people. We have to eat, and we want to have a comfortable life and not have to worry all the time. So we want to make a living. And if I'm making a living, I'm also aware that I I'm a mortal being. I only have a certain amount of time on the earth, and I'm only going to have a certain amount of time in my career, maybe 30, 40, 50 years if I'm lucky. So my time becomes precious because I don't have unlimited energy. I got to sleep, I got to eat, I want to see my family, I want to do other things besides being in the lab doing science. So you're correct. Most of the time, when you've invested a lot of time in investigating something and doesn't come out the way you thought it would, it is depressing. I remember as a grad student putting my head on my desk a lot of times and just wanting to sleep because things weren't working. Uh, and then what you find out is that, hopefully, is that if you take a slightly different approach, things do start working. But it is tedious and sometimes discouraging. And the only thing I can tell you is that almost everybody I know goes through those feelings.
Goes through those feelings.
So you have a camaraderie around that, a common experience.
Are you saying in general humans can be wrong?
Oh, yes, way more than right.
A weird thing to say. No, okay. This is a little cutesy of me, but there were some terms that I had thought about when I was writing
Okay.
my outline. And one of them, I always, one of the things most of us tend to do is say, is that provable? Is that provable? But then when I was in school, I learned the term falsifiability. Do you think that is an important distinction?
I do.
All
They're
right.
crucially important. And I think Karl Popper was the philosopher that emphasized that the most,
okay.
the British philosopher. So this is what I was talking about before about you cannot prove a hypothesis. You can only disprove it or find supporting evidence for it. And that goes to the concept of falsifiability. A hypothesis is falsifiable. We can disprove it. So if you say, I hypothesize the moon is made of green cheese, and I take a rocket ship and go up there and look around, and there's no green cheese anywhere, and all my instruments don't detect green cheese, but they detect a lot of moon rocks and so forth, then I come back and I say, I found no supporting evidence for your hypothesis. And until proven otherwise, I have falsified your hypothesis.
Okay.
If you say, I hypothesize that 2 plus 3 is 4, then a mathematician would be able to show by some, manipulations of numbers that that was in fact wrong. So they have falsified your hypothesis.
Okay.
So in more complex systems, though, than green cheese and 2 plus 3, if we're talking about, say, a geological event that happened in the past that we're trying to reconstruct, like one of the big extinction events.
Oh, wow.
And we have multiple lines of data, like, well, there was these strata and the oxygen signal from the ocean went up and then it went down and then it went up again. And these volcanoes over here were going on and there might have been an asteroid impact. How in the world are you going to sort through all this? Because it happened 300 million years ago. And it's a very tedious, time-consuming, takes years type process. And there are many lines of evidence. There's not just one line of evidence. There might be rocks. There might be fossils in the rocks that tell you, oh, these animals died out real suddenly at this time frame because we can date the rocks, right? How does that fit with the oxygen in the oceans going up and down? Is the timing the same? What about the volcanoes? When did they go off? And what sort of global warming did they initiate, or methane release, or all kinds of factors like that? And so you have lots of hypotheses.
Yeah.
So in that case, what you would have is probably not one hypothesis, like the volcanoes are the causative factor of the extinction, or the asteroid was the causative factor. You'd have multiple hypotheses, and together, then we would call that a theory.
Okay, that was I was going to ask you the difference between theory and notion, a hypothesis. Yeah.
In actual practice, that's how I think of theory, is a network of interlocking hypotheses. And so the theory might be something caused the Permian extinction. That might be your theory. There were some events that we can find that caused the extinction. That's the general theory. And the hypotheses would be, oh, this might have been part of it, this might have been part of it, and this might have been part of it. Now, a good example would be the end Cretaceous extinction of the dinosaurs. So everybody's pretty familiar with the fact there was an asteroid impact in the area of the Yucatan that caused a lot of environmental changes and laid down an observable geological signal in the form of an iridium layer in the rocks that can be dated very precisely. And so that for a long time was a very dominant hypothesis, and still is. But then later analyses have shown that, well, guess what? A lot of the dinosaur lineages were already dying out before the asteroid hit. So maybe it was just the final death knell, not the overall cause of the extinction.
Wow.
So that's a different level of it's not falsifiable completely. It's just an incomplete hypothesis.
Yeah,
See?
yeah.
So
Oh, I see. There's some things that
there's some gray
yeah,
zones,
yeah.
and that's where I think you have to accept the fact that um, there's kind of a murky line between what we call a hypothesis and what we call a theory. And so, if your hypothesis is that the um, meteor, the asteroid impact in the late Cretaceous caused the dinosaurs to go extinct, you'd have to modify that hypothesis and say it caused the final extinction event of the dinosaurs. That's the proper
And
outcome based on the data that we have. It's not the only event that caused the extinction, it's the final event.
so in a way, if it's impossible to potentially negate your hypothesis, then it's really not testable.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. It has to be falsifiable to be testable. That's where the falsifiability comes in. So, um, you know, if let's see, what can I think of?
I'm trying to think of an example that's
Well,
not...
if I have a hypothesis that says I believe that aliens planted all the trees that we see in the world, that's not a testable hypothesis.
Okay.
And a lot of scientists and other philosophers would say, well, you know, the idea that any sort of super being, God or whatever, did anything is not a testable hypothesis. It's just not within the realm of scientific inquiry because there's nothing to observe. And so people that are interested in things like UFOs and aliens and that kind of stuff, or other, quote, rare events, there's really no way for science to address those issues unless something can be observed. Okay. Another place that it comes up is there's an interesting YouTube video with Richard Feynman, a famous physicist from the 60s and the 50s through the 80s, really. And he's talking about electric charge. You know, we have positive and negative charges.
Oh, wow.
And the person asks him, well, what exactly is electric charge? And he goes, oh, we don't have any idea. All we know is what it does. See, so that to me is intellectual honesty, where you say, this is the limit of what we can say.
Yeah.
We don't know anything about this except it has two opposite properties. And it does this kind of stuff, and you can, you know, make your refrigerator work when you plug it in. You know, so that's the thing. Science is a limited but very useful approach to understanding parts of the world.
Yeah, it's good for what can be checked. There may be something that doesn't seem falsifiable. In the future, you might find out that there are ways. But okay, I bring that up because, well, because again, it's actually very interesting to even try to describe. But for me, it's like, again, I can't check, or like you said, if it's something that you can't observe, it wouldn't be necessarily to scientific inquiry. And then people, I guess, need to decide for themselves how much that matters. If they believe they have another way of inquiring upon truth, they basically are in the responsible position of deciding if that's a good way.
Yeah, and I think the word you just used, belief, is very important. I know that was one of the things on your list. And as a scientist, I don't traffic in belief because it doesn't get me anywhere. It's an assumption of some kind or a bias of some kind. And I might be very interested in having a belief that treating other people well will be good for me as well as to them. That's a very core belief that a lot of us have, but it's not a scientific statement.
Yes.
It might be to a sociologist. A sociologist may be able to come up with a study that tests that belief and puts it in the form of a hypothesis and says something like, in this situation, do people that treat other people well have better outcomes? And that may be a way to test it.
You can measure them on all kinds of, do they wind up healthy or do they wind up
Mhm.
rating as happy or do they wind up wealthier? All that you can see
So
an outcome.
so a belief isn't necessarily always going to have to stay a belief, but
Ah, ah.
we need to recognize when we're making a statement or expressing a belief. So if I believe that all mainstream media is untrustworthy, then I'm not going to get very far, right? Because I've excluded a whole bunch of things from observation by just saying I'm
Ah.
writing them off. And so the more intellectually honest thing to do would be to say, I suspect there might be dishonest elements within mainstream media. Let me go find out which ones I can trust and which ones I can't.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe
Mm-hmm.
even within, and I have this experience, I'm sure a lot of us have that keep up with the news, even within a single publication, like, say, the Washington Post, there might be columnists that I regularly read because I tend to trust their perspective or get something out of it. And there's other ones I will never read because I don't trust where they're coming from.
Yeah, right. You build up.
So we
Yeah.
all do that, and
Yep.
we all make decisions about what to trust and what not to trust. But I think your point is really important one, that we owe it to ourselves, just for our sanity, if nothing else, to be clear when we're making a judgment based on evidence,
Mm-hmm.
and a judgment should always be looked at as a contingent judgment because things can change.
No evidence. Yeah.
Or are we making a judgment based on belief?
Yeah. I like the idea for myself that I chose a belief. I felt it was reasonable to choose it for one reason. It helps me function, makes me happier, keeps me honest, whatever. But that I chose it, meaning I take responsibility for
Yeah,
holding that
right.
belief. And eventually, I will change that belief, I hope, if I have a good reason to change it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to hold it too tightly at all, in
Right.
general. Yeah.
Well, I think that what you're getting at is something that you have to learn to do science, and that is to live with a lot of ambiguity. Because most, like I said, your ignorance increases faster than your knowledge, and
Yeah.
most of the time, all your answers are contingent and subject to change because new variables will come along. For example, we didn't know until recent times that honeybees see in the ultraviolet, for example. That's a big difference from
That's
us.
cool.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we didn't even have that information,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't hear in well, we define ultrasound as what we don't hear,
Well, we
but
don't
we
hear.
don't hear in upper high frequencies like dolphins,
Mm-hmm. Right.
for example.
Yeah.
So these are things that are not observable to us unless we have extended senses in the forms of technological instruments
Mm-hmm.
that allow us to access that, like a microphone that will record at those frequencies. We can hear the dolphins uh, vocalizing and so forth. So um, I think the idea of everything is sort of
Mm-hmm.
contingent and conditional, and new data comes in, and you have to be ready to change your matrix of outlook.
Yeah.
You learn to do that as a scientist because that's just the way it works. And I think it applies to the rest of life a lot of times too. But a lot of people are not as comfortable with ambiguity.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of sports a little bit. I'm very bad at sports facts. I'm going to start getting into sports more. But I know that, for example, I believe that because someone wins a Super Bowl, that doesn't mean they're the best team in the league.
Right.
If they win a bunch of Super Bowls in a row, that I'm going to have a little bit more. That supports the idea that they're very, very good compared to the other teams
Right.
a lot more. And yet I can find friends who will be arguing like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
They should have won, though. They
Right.
should have won.
Right.
And I think that's valid because, maybe they could set up a better test than the Super Bowl, or
Right.
whatever. So that's just I was going to see if there's anything last because
Sure.
I wanted to appear disciplined on time. I don't really care about.
I don't really care about the time.
Oh, okay, that's
go as
cool.
long as you want.
And let me see what we got here. Does funding affect science? Why does correlation and randomized control? We talked about that. What is falsifiability? Robustness we hinted at when you're looking over doing reviews of literature and whatnot. we talked about what we can do if we're not steeped in the literature. Um, and actually, I think that's pretty good. Any burning last assertions in your?
Um, well, I think that, to bring it to the present moment, we're in 2021, we're still in the throes of a pandemic. And unfortunately, I think the attitudes about science play a key role
Nowadays,
in
yeah.
the people's behavior these days and who to trust.
Yeah.
Whether you trust information coming out of the public health arena might determine whether you get a vaccine or not, in many, many cases that I'm aware of. So I think um, in this instance, it's very understandable why in the beginning of vaccine development people were hesitant, because it was done so rapidly, and these mRNA vaccines were new technology.
Oh, right.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
even myself, I waited and read a lot before I decided to get the vaccine. But to to me, it was a matter of looking at data and
Mhm.
trying to uh, feel at what point was I comfortable with the safety issue. I wasn't, efficacy in clinical settings. You're usually worried about safety and efficacy of a treatment. Those are the two key words.
Mhm.
And with a vaccine, it's no different. So efficacious means that it's effective at what it's trying to do, which is prevent disease. And safety, of course, means there's few adverse side effects, or that your chances of having them are pretty low. But my um, I became aware that there were a lot of people that didn't even want to hear what the CDC had to say, and they weren't reading scientific reports, even in places like the New York Times, which had extensive articles about how the vaccines worked, how they were developed, and other mainstream publications. Similarly, the BBC News, the Guardian, all kinds of just normal publications, not scientific publications, were putting out information. But a lot of people have such, I don't know what to call it except an anti-science bias, that they feel like uh, it's all about, drug companies trying to make money, or it's a big hoax, or something like that. And I find that unfortunate, because what it means to me is that, like I said in the beginning, either the scientific community, broadly speaking, has not been effective enough in continuously informing the public about advances that are being made and findings that are being made, or the public's just not interested, and that's why you don't hear those kind of reports very often on mainstream, say, MSNBC, when you're watching the news. They have a lot of stuff about politics and the economy, but very little about science. Is it their job to have more about science? They're responding to their audience.
Yeah.
And they would
Yeah.
say, my guess is they would say, we're just giving the audience what it wants to hear. If we had a science segment, nobody would watch it. We used to have shows like Nova.
Yeah.
Remember Nova?
Yeah.
And other shows like that. And of course, it was on PBS, so not everybody watched it. But for instance, I'll say Carl Sagan. There's a great example of a wonderful science communicator. Another one in the same lineage is Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah.
Now, those people are magnetic personalities. They have a gift of communication, and they're also experts in their field. That's a rare combination. And obviously, we would love to have more people like that and have them be able to be successful at gaining audiences. I would say that in addition to the other science outlets that I mentioned, there are lots of really good YouTube videos having to do with science. Um, you know, YouTube is like the internet in general. There's a lot of garbage on it, and there's a lot of great stuff on it. And unfortunately, you have to weed through it to find out what are the trusted sources. One of my favorite is an Australian guy that has a website called Veritasium. I don't know if you're familiar with
That sounds familiar, but I don't.
He's really wonderful. He's either Canadian or Australian or a mixture of both. But anyway, he has a great website, Veritasium. and he's had Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson on there and other people. So there are, and he tends to cover more physics and stuff like that. There's 3 Blue, 1 Brown is a great math website that discusses all kinds of, have wonderful graphics. But there are other websites like Harvard, I think, has a wonderful video about microbial evolution, and they show you time lapse of microbial evolution in a laboratory setting and how it works. So there are lots of good resources that are pretty easy to get at on YouTube, and they're fun to watch too because they've got visual content.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to put in a plug for a show called This Week in Virology.
Oh, yeah.
There's a guy named Vincent Rackaniello. He's like, he says it rhymes with black and yellow, makes it easier to remember. Doesn't make it easier to spell for some of us. But he gets a bunch of his virologist buddies to chit chat about it. It's very snarky. It's very, conversational, but they're conducting research constantly, and they're also bringing in papers on other people's and telling you their opinions of them. And it reminds me to keep curious and keep correctable, because 100 years from now, something that is highly supported and some of the best stuff may or may not be as well supported 100 years from now.
Yeah.
And so keep going.
I think you're exactly right. Having an open mind is a difficult but necessary thing.
Yeah, I've intentionally agonized myself watching sources of information and sources of information,
right,
so that I'm not pretending that I watched them and nixed them. I actually sat through the process. And it forces me to actually hear things within maybe a whole lot of BS that somebody's saying, whom I totally think might be not a good source of information, but I'll hear a point or something that actually does make sense within a bunch. So I actually think going through the aggravating process of continually reopening, well, how do I say this? Continuing to search, being willing to wade through some things you think might be crap.
Yeah.
Maybe not all the time. Yeah. So.
No, I think that's.
I guess what I'm talking about is opposing voices.
It's very true, and I think part of keeping an open mind is keeping my curiosity active, because that's what drives me to want to know. Well, maybe there's another point of view, or maybe there's another piece of data since I last looked into this issue. Because there always is these days. We live in the information age. And that means there's always more stuff out there that we're not aware of that we could be aware of. So it's a full-time job being a YouTube jockey or whatever your favorite mode of interaction is. But the podcast or blog or whatever it is you mentioned on virology, I'm familiar with that.
You're familiar with that one? That's kind of fun. So I think I made something short into a longer explanation, but the idea for me is that I like to listen to people. I don't like to listen to people with whom I disagree, but I do it anyway. And I do balance it by listening to a variety of sources of information.
I think that's a really important thing, particularly for me with more murky areas like politics and the economy. Choosing multiple sources is crucial. And I shy away from things like Facebook and Twitter, and even I don't have a television because I don't want to have the message dramatized.
Yes.
Or be reactive because there's only this many characters that can be used. So I prefer magazine articles like that are longer and more thoughtful, or longer articles in a newspaper. If you're really interested in digesting complicated material, then I think you owe it to yourself to do what you're saying, to suck it up and engage in the long haul, because otherwise you're going to get snippets that may not cohere into a whole point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's not a bad place to stop.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, this is great.
I looked at my clock and I said, arbitrarily, let's try an hour, and we did all right.
Good.
And
We can do it again
I'm not
if
going
you
to say
want.
numerically what all right means, but
Yeah.
goodbye, everybody.